We are publishing all Dr. Freud, and I glance at the proof and read how Mr. A.B. threw a bottle of red ink onto the sheets of his marriage bed to excuse his impotence to the housemaid, but threw it in the wrong place, which unhinged his wife's mind, and to this day she pours claret on the dinner table. We could all go on like that for hours, and yet these Germans thinks it proves something, besides their own gull-like imbecility. They're always condemned in like these kind of gustatory terms as bad diet. So QD Leavis condemns her as detrimental diet. She's described as suet pudding to be sucked down by addicted female readers.
Not again.
How again? Again. Once
I've had the joy of reading Modernism's Readers, which is actually a really difficult sentence to say, which is like, a brilliant book about psychoanalysis, modernism, and I'm going to read my first question actually does sort of explain it a little bit, so I will go into it. I'll give you a little bit of how the session will run. I'm going to sort of ask a little bit about how the project came about, then sort of go into sort of modernism, psychoanalysis in the UK, fictional scenes of reading, The Child Reader, Ethel M, Dell, Mourning Redemption and the Waves, Marion, Milner and Fascism, and then Post-Truth at the end. It's been a real delight to read your book. So one of the things I really appreciate is how it engages with long-standing debates about how modernist texts method from the outside. The book turns to the scenes of reading within these texts themselves, as if the clues had been there all along. By reading these scenes alongside accounts of reading in psychoanalytic theory, you develop a rich and nuanced account of what it means to read modernist literature. Could you tell us a little bit about how this project came about?
Of course. Thank you, Bradley. Thank you for having me here today. And I can't thank you enough for reading my book so carefully. It's really amazing to be read. It's a book about reading. So, of course, I'm particularly thrilled that you've read it so carefully. But you've sent me some questions in advance. And it's an amazing thing to have somebody read your work and think about it and get it. And you've summarized it perfectly. So it's a book that came about. It's quite a boring answer in some ways. It came about because I did a PhD on it. This book, a physical copy of it here with a nice image by Virginia Woolf's sister, Vanessa Bell, of a girl reading. And this image really does encapsulate what the book does. It's a book that looks at scenes in literary texts where people are kind of immersed in books in this kind of way. And the PhD began as a project. It began through me thinking about why it is that so many modernist texts and avant-garde texts are so difficult to read. I was doing a PhD at Queen Mary, University of London, and for a long time I was interested in a kind of dilemma I felt about the existing critical debates about what it means to read modernist literature. So there's a very dominant critical account, the one it's articulated by a critic called John Carey in his book, The Intellectuals and the Masses. And he argues that modernism and other kinds of avant-garde forms of writing were difficult because they were trying to exclude certain kinds of readers. So his argument is, in response to late 19th century educational reforms and advances in mass publishing, a group of elitist writers set about writing really, really difficult texts because they didn't want ordinary people to read them. It's a kind of a knee-jerk reaction that a lot of people do have when they first encounter some of these kinds of difficult forms of writing. They feel like they are being shut out, and that perhaps this is a move on the part of the writers to exclude people. There are, I think, some specific cases of modernist writers who were snobs or, in some cases, downright fascists who did want to exclude certain kinds of reader. But I was also interested in the opposite argument. So there's another very dominant argument in more theoretical writing about modernism by theorists like Theodor Adorno, and also Leo Bersani is another one. People who are interested in the idea that kind of experience that we have when we read a really difficult modernist text, that experience of difficulty is itself a kind of performance of a kind of resistance against the status quo. So for Adorno, when we read a difficult text by an author like Samuel Beckett, or when we listen to a difficult piece of music, or we look at certain kinds of painting, that kind of experience that we have of not being able to easily consume it is a kind of resistance basically against mass culture, but against the kinds of mass culture that are trying to numb us as readers and consumers and turn us into passive consumers. And so Adorno was writing in response to and in the wake of fascism, and thinking about the ways in which aspects of mass culture were trying to numb people's minds. And so he makes an argument that there's this kind of difficult form of writing and artistic production that sort of stages of resistance to mass culture. So I was interested in these kinds of theories and arguments about why it is that modernist writing can be so difficult to read. And then I started to realize that actually the modernist texts that I was really interested in, texts by Virginia Woolf in particular and Marcel Proust, long modernist novels particularly, that these texts actually continually return to scenes in which readers read books, or people listen to music, or look at paintings. And so I realized that these modernist texts are often kind of staging encounters with different kinds of cultural objects. And so I started to look at how the novels themselves are telling us to read them. Would it be helpful if I read one of these scenes?
Yeah, that would be really good. Yeah.
So I'll tell you about a scene that I start the book with. So this is from Virginia Woolf's 1931 novel, The Waves, which is perhaps one of her most challenging, most poetic novels. It's a novel that really strains against what we might think of as a novel. Like, the plot is very basic and it reads like a kind of poetry. And this is a character called Neville, and he goes to a bookcase and he takes down a book. And this is the scene. Certainly, Neville comments, one cannot read this poem without effort. To read this poem, one must have myriad eyes, like one of those lamps that turns on slabs of racing water at midnight in the Atlantic, when perhaps only a spray of seaweed pricks the surface, or suddenly the waves gape and up shoulders a monster. One must put aside antipathies and jealousies and not interrupt. One must have patience and infinite care, and let the light sound, whether of spiders' delicate feet on a leaf, or the chuckle of water in some irrelevant drainpipe, unfold too. Nothing is to be rejected in fear or horror. The poet who has written this page has withdrawn. There are no commas or semicolons. The lines do not run in convenient lengths. Much is sheer nonsense. One must be sceptical, but throw caution to the winds, and when the door opens, accept absolutely. Also sometimes weep. Also cut away ruthlessly with a slice of the blade, soot, bark, hard accretions of all sorts. And so, while they talk, let down one's net deeper and deeper, and gently draw in and bring to the surface what he said and she said, and make poetry. So in this scene, we have this character in a really sort of self-consciously strange and poetic book, taking a book down from the bookshelf and commenting on this experience of reading that involves effort and difficulty and challenge, but also which is very deeply immersive and kind of strange. And so I'm interested in what scenes like this tell us about the experience that we're also having as readers of these books.
That's a great answer. So while the book focuses predominantly on Virginia Woolf, it offers a wider engagement with modernist literature. And in your account, modernism seems to encompass not just literary text, but also aesthetic theory, particularly the works of Bell and Freud, as well as psychoanalysis. I'm always a little cautious about using the term like modernism, modernity, postmodernism, as they can easily become quite vague or heavily loaded. So with that in mind, what is modernism? And could you give us some context for the discourses that shaped your investigation?
I hate this question. I love all your other questions. No, it's a really important question. And you're absolutely right. We have to be really cautious around these terms. So at various points, this project shifted in focus and the book had different names. I pitched a book that had the subtitle, what was it? So it's called Reading Modernism's Readers. And I pitched a book that was called Reading Modernism's Readers, Modernism, Psychoanalysis, and the Bestseller. And the editors and peer reviewers suggested I shift the title to be Virginia Woolf, Psychoanalysis, and the Bestseller, which does more accurately reflect what the book does. It is more focused on Woolf, but also there was a kind of worry about that term. I also had to take out a massive chunk of the introduction where I really went into very laboured discussions about what constitutes modernism, because the editor just said, can you just scrap all of this? It's too boring. But these are important questions. I'd say that, so in this book, it's true, Woolf is the main focus, but I also include quite lengthy discussions of Proust, of a popular writer called Ethel M. Dell, who we might talk a bit more about later, and a number of different psychoanalytic writers, Sigmund Freud, Melanie, Klein, James Strachey, and a psychoanalyst and writer, an artist called Marion Milner, who I read as both a kind of late modernist and a psychoanalyst. At the end of the book, I also turn to contemporary writers who claim allegiance to the modernism of the early 20th century. So I include a discussion of the writer Emma McBride and her 2013 novel, A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing. So I'm interested in contemporary writers who are also kind of claiming an allegiance to earlier kinds of modernism. So I'd say, for me, my approach to modernism is, I hope it is anyway, capacious. I'm interested in what we might call modernisms, which I know Sarah teaches a course at Sussex, which you've called modernisms, partly in tribute to, I think, Peter Nichols's book, which is just really saying, like, let's recognize there are lots of different modernisms across different places and also time periods. So I hope that certainly in my teaching and in my work as director of the Centre for Modernist Studies at Sussex, I aim to be as capacious as possible. For lots of people, modernism broadly might describe like the kind of explosion of artistic experiment from the late 19th century through to the present day, perhaps, but particularly focused on the early 20th century. People tend to be focused on a kind of explosion in artistic experiment in Britain, the US, and in continental Europe. For a long time, as you'll know, what was taught in, say, literature departments were kind of these very dominant, like, white men, James Joyce, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, perhaps the occasional reference to avant-garde movements in continental Europe and the occasional reference to someone like Virginia Woolf. But things have really changed in recent years. There's a kind of been a movement in modernist studies that we talk about as the new modernist studies, which has seen a massive expansion of what we consider to be modernism, both in terms of geography and kind of temporality. So there's been an expansion of modernism to think about different forms, different cultural forms, different artistic forms, as well as different places and different moments in history. My book is quite narrowly focused on a particular kind of early 20th century modernism in Britain and Europe and its legacies today. But I'm also, when I think more broadly about modernism in my work as a teacher and a writer, then I aim to be more expansive.
So there's like a narrow focus and there's a expansive focus.
Yeah.
Still be great to have a sort of ladybird book.
What, a ladybird book of modernism?
Yeah.
The springboard, like you've told us how it's expanded.
Okay, like what it's expanded from. Yeah. I think, so my book is focused largely on Virginia Woolf, Marcel Proust, big, long experimental novels that were breaking with the kind of traditional form of the novel at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. So this kind of moment where traditional forms of novel writing and poetry are kind of broken down and people are experimenting with new ways of writing. That's in the literary world, but also new ways of painting and making things. Is that a bit better? Yeah, all kinds of different movements across different disciplines and different kinds of cultural production. Breaking with tradition, making it new is often the catchphrase associated with modernism.
Would you consider psychoanalysis as modernist as well?
I think so.
Yeah.
But, well, like both, a lot of modernist writers, like what I'm about to say about Freud and psychoanalysis, are also deeply rooted in 19th century traditions and sometimes struggle to break from those as much as they might want to. Yeah, I think psychoanalysis is part of modernism, but like other kinds of modernism has important connections to 19th century traditions.
Like the Enlightenment and Romanticism.
Yeah.
So the book also traces the British reception of psychoanalysis, of the largest library of the psychoanalytic writings in English. Alongside Freud, you explore James Strachey, Melanie Klein, Marion Milner. Could you tell us a little bit about psychoanalysis, how it was received and developed in the UK, and how the context informs your reading of modernist literature.
So there are different ways of telling this history, of course. But I'd say interest in Freud and in psychoanalysis first appears in Britain when a group of writers, intellectuals, academics, medical doctors and psychologists first start reading Freud, mostly in Cambridge in the early 20th century. And at first, there's a really fascinating kind of cross interest with different kinds of occult phenomena and spiritualism. So there's this kind of group of people in and around Cambridge in the early 20th century who are interested in the occult, in spiritualism, in what was called psychical research. People like Frederick Myers, they're all interested in forms of telepathy and the unconscious, and in Freud. And Freud too is interested in these things. Some of you will know mine and Sarah's colleague Nick Royal, who's written an entire book about the uncanny and is interested in the kind of intersections between Freud's uncanny and telepathy. So there's this like moment of the late 19th, early 20th century interest in the unconscious that comes out of these kinds of investigations into spiritualism and occult phenomena. There's a group of, as I said, writers, academics, some of them medical doctors and psychologists who start reading Freud. And Cambridge is a particularly important locus for the dissemination of Freud's writings in this time. The people that we later come to associate with what we might call Bloomsbury modernism. So people like Virginia Woolf's husband, Leonard Woolf, the economist John Maynard Keynes, Lytton Strachey, Virginia Woolf's great friend. All of these men were at Cambridge at a time when interest in Freud was taking hold, and a lot of them encountered Freud for the first time by reading him in Cambridge. And from the start, there's an emphasis on Freud as somebody who's a kind of imaginative thinker. So not just a scientist, or perhaps not even a scientist. I've put down a quote here somewhere from Leonard Woolf, who wrote a review around 1914, I think it was, and he writes about Freud's great subtlety of mind and admires what he calls a broad and sweeping imagination, more characteristic of the poet than the scientist or the medical practitioner. So they're kind of positioning Freud as somebody who's a kind of a poet of the mind, not just a scientist. Anyway, a number of these people, some of them go to Vienna and have psychoanalysis with Freud. Lytton Strachey's brother, James Strachey, goes to Vienna, has psychoanalysis with Freud. And that's a really important moment for the history of psychoanalysis. James Strachey and his wife, Alex, start translating Freud's work into English. And then in 1924, James Strachey kind of goes to Virginia and Leonard Woolf and suggests that they start publishing Freud. And so the Woolfs, who've started their own publishing press, the Hogarth Press, during the First World War, start to publish Freud and other psychoanalytic writings in English. And they become his chief publishers in England. And it's a big deal. I mean, in financial terms, they take on this huge library of psychoanalytic writings. The Hogarth Press began as a really small endeavor. Literally, the Woolfs bought a printing press and set it up on their kitchen table during the First World War. And they started by publishing modernist poets and experimental writers like T.S. Eliot and Catherine Mansfield and Gertrude Stein. And they're often characterized and I think mischaracterized as a coterie press, people who published only for their friends and for a kind of intimate group of people. But they were also publishing political essays and pamphlets. They were publishing anti-colonial writings, and they were also publishing psychoanalysis from 1924 onwards. So they become Freud's chief translators, and they're part of this moment where lots of people now in kind of Bloomsbury in London are interested in Freud and learning to practice as psychoanalysts. Virginia Woolf's brother and sister-in-law, Adrian and Karen Stephen, trained as psychoanalysts at this time and hosted the psychoanalyst Melanie Klein, who came over to London in 1925, gave a series of really important lectures about child psychoanalysis in Virginia Woolf's brother's drawing room. And she then decided to move to London and becomes a key figure in pioneering child psychoanalysis, where the analyst works with children through play and drawing, rather in more traditional Freudian adult psychoanalysis. The patient lies on the couch and talks about their dreams and free associates, but Melanie Klein develops a kind of working with children through play and through drawing, and she becomes really important in the British Psychoanalytical Society. So the Woolfs were really important in the dissemination of psychoanalytic writing, but there's a twist, which is that Virginia Woolf was really, really ambivalent, perhaps even hostile towards Freud, and uncertain about her role as his publisher. She was actively involved in publishing Freud, and you can read in her diaries about her handling of the books, but she refuses to actually read them until after Freud had died, which I think is not insignificant. I've got a few passages here. So this is this is Woolf in 1924. She writes, all the psychoanalyst books have been dumped in a fortress the size of Windsor Castle in ruins upon the floor. She describes doing up Freud. I in 2 jackets, for it is freezing, and hair down, he, her colleague, in shirt sleeves. So she's physically involved in bringing Freud's writing into press. But then she writes, there are moments like this is from 1924 too. She writes, I shall be plunged in publishing affairs at once. We are publishing all Dr. Freud, and I glance at the proof and read how Mr. A.B. threw a bottle of red ink onto the sheets of his marriage bed to excuse his impotence to the housemaid, but threw it in the wrong place, which unhinged his wife's mind, and to this day she pours claret on the dinner table. We could all go on like that for hours, and yet these Germans thinks it proves something besides their own gull-like imbecility. So like you can really feel her distaste, her dislike of Freud's writing here. She writes an essay around this time called Freudian Fiction, which is actually a review of a popular novel by a man called J.D. Beresford, and it's a novel called An Imperfect Mother. And it's a very, the title says it all. It is a very kind of cliched, psychoanalytically, I was going to say informed, but isn't that my point is kind of that it's not psychoanalytically informed. It's a kind of very crass version of psychoanalysis. One of the things that I argue in the book is actually that Woolf's dismissal of what she calls Freudian fiction is based not on a reading of Freud. It's like based on a reading of popular versions of psychoanalysis in popular novels. And there's some kind of overlapping of her disdain for popular fiction there. And she refuses to read him. She meets him in 1939. Freud comes to live in London. He's fleeing Nazi occupation of Vienna, and Virginia and Leonard Woolf go to meet him. And Woolf writes about their visit in really striking terms in her diary, but still refuses to read him until she kind of announces in her diary the death of Freud. And it's at that point that she picks his books up and actually starts to read them. And then with bombs dropping all around, she suddenly finds herself, like she writes in her diary, that she's gulping up Freud. And she reads a lot of his kind of more social texts and his texts about group psychology and death and war. And actually, I think that when she finally reads him after he's died, she finds they actually have quite a lot in common in terms of the way that they think about groups and about the psychology of groups.
Was her basis for not earlier purely when she was working on it, dipping into Reading and stuff?
Sometime in the late 30s, an academic writes to Virginia Woolf and asks her about the influence of Freud and psychoanalysis on her writing. And she claims that she's never read any Freud or any psychoanalyst seriously, and that all that she knows of it comes from superficial talk. But the thing is, superficial talk for her, like her brother was a psychoanalyst. She was friends with lots of the people who were translating Freud, who'd had psychoanalysis with Freud himself. She's part of this kind of like group of people who are, her superficial chit chat is quite intimately involved. So I think there's a kind of defensiveness that is, there are many reasons that are to do with her own kind of dislike of this kind of these popular versions of psychoanalysis, her complicated feelings about her brother who was a psychoanalyst. So she records his own responses to his experience of being psychoanalyzed, where she and her sister Vanessa feel like they're being kind of blamed for his problems, to put it very simply.
And do you think even a sort of, to crude to say, sort of British fastidiousness, I think about my parents in the 60s, horror that it was sort of unseen?
No, because there is a moment very early on where she talks about Lytton Strachey being involved in a group. I can't remember which group it was. It was one of the many kind of groupings of people involved in sort of different kinds of psychological research at the time. And she talks about how they're interested in the theories of Freud and incest. And she says, I think of becoming a member. Because actually she's sort of like the Bloomsbury group are quite interested in like shocking that kind of like British fastidiousness. So it's not that, it's not squeamishness. There's a kind of resistance to the like Freud's accounts of gender and femininity, I think. Yeah, I think that's the kind of the main source of it.
One of the central concepts in the book is what you describe as the staged, fictionalized encounter with literary texts within modernist novels themselves. I found this a fascinating approach, as though the literature is performing or even modeling a way of reading. It also feels at times as if the fiction is doing its own theoretization or self-commentary. What do we gain from paying attention to these scenes of reading within the literature itself?
This is what I meant when I said that you've really got the book, Bradley. Thank you. You've summarised it perfectly.
Thank you.
As I wrote the book, I came to realise that while I was searching around, grappling with all these different theories about reading, that actually the texts themselves, particularly long modernist novels, but also some modernist poems too, were themselves theorising reading for me, and in much richer and more complicated ways than many of the theorists that I was grappling with were doing. So there are these scenes, again and again, we find scenes in which characters, especially in Woolf's writing, but elsewhere too, are reading poetry, listening to music, looking at paintings. There are scenes in Woolf's novel, The Waves, where a character called Bernard goes to the National Gallery after the death of one of his friends and sort of sits and performs his own kind of mourning ritual whilst looking at paintings in the National Gallery. So everywhere there are these scenes where characters are engaging with different kinds of cultural objects, whether it's literature or music or visual arts. And what I'm arguing in the book is that when we read about fictional characters, they're sort of fictional characters, whilst they are engaged in these scenes of reading, the texts are sort of in some ways teaching us how to read, or soliciting us to read them in a certain way, or maybe not even so much though teaching, because they're not preaching to us about how to read. They're sort of just asking us to be mindful about what it is that we're after when we read books. What I think that what Woolf's scenes of reading in particular do is sort of make you as a reader much more alert to what kind of fantasies about reading we bring to the text. So whether we're looking for pleasure or consolation, or lots of the characters in Woolf's novels are looking for a kind of refuge, somewhere to escape. Sometimes readers in Woolf's novels are looking for forms of community. And so I think that these scenes are asking us to think about what it is we're looking to find when we read.
You write that Freud returned frequently to literary analysis and later discussed his account of screen memories, where fairy tales, for example, seem to stand for repressed memories. In what ways is psychoanalysis, like modernist literature, also invested in the act of reading and interpretation?
Psychoanalysis is very invested in reading and in interpretation. So in a way, also, I think this is the answer about why Virginia Woolf was resistant to psychoanalysis. So I think that the idea of psychoanalysis as a kind of interpretation, as a kind of reading, is precisely why so many modernist writers were so hostile to psychoanalysis. I think that it's not just Woolf who was hostile to Freud, as I think I mentioned earlier. Catherine Mansfield complained about what she called, this is a phrase from her, she called it the mushroom growth of cheap psychoanalysis. You see again, there's she's talking about popular novels again there, but there's a kind of disdain for it. T.S. Eliot, he worries about, this is his phrase, the soul of man under psychoanalysis. D.H. Lawrence, he was outraged by what he called the vicious half statements of the Freudians. And in Finnegan's Wake, James Joyne mocked this is his phrase, young and easily Freudian. So he's punning there on Carl Jung. He mocks the young and easily Freudian, and he issues a word of warning to his readers to be wary of making what he calls Freudful mistakes. So all of them are kind of anxious about a kind of a method of reading, a method of interpretation. They're anxious about, the philosopher Paul Ricoeur calls the hermeneutics of suspicion, that kind of symptomatic approach to reading. I think they were troubled by what they saw as a symptomatic approach to reading, where you might approach a literary text as you might a patient. So they're worried about a theory that they perceive in psychoanalysis. I'm not sure it's actually there, but they're worried that the literary text is kind of treated like a patient, subordinated to the kind of the master key. So worry about kind of a method of reading and interpretation that's about mastery.
Is it also about that singular interpretation rather than having multiple readings? Yes.
In her essay on Freudian fiction, Woolf writes about how there's a kind of fascination with this kind of new discourse of analysis, but she worries about the claim to having the master key. Mm-hmm. And it's that you could unlock, but it's not unlocking, because it's fixing the kind of multiplicity of a literary text by saying, no, it means this. Yeah. And so I think that's the fear about psychoanalysis. I have to say, I think in many ways it's a misreading of of psychoanalysis at its best and its most interesting. Freud writes an essay in 1910 called Wild Psychoanalysis, in which he's trying to distinguish Freudian psychoanalysis from the many different kinds of popular versions and wild versions of psychoanalysis that were proliferating at this time. And in some ways, I think that like Woolf and Joyce and others were themselves responding to wild psychoanalysis and not really reading Freud at his best. I'll also acknowledge that Freud absolutely himself is guilty of wild analysis and kind of vulgar analysis. And also Freud himself is one of the worst kind of readers of literary texts. Like that's where Freud is, I think, is least interesting. Yes, it's a discourse of interpretation and of reading. And that's where the conflict with literary writers. And I'm talking about modernists here, but I think it's the case for many different kinds of literary writers and creatives that there's a kind of anxiety around this aspect of psychoanalysis that it might fix things where things should be freer.
Yeah, because a lot of modernist novels there's a multiplicity of interpretations, and there's a multiplicity of something going on that's actually disrupting easy interpretation.
Yeah. But also, and it's a lot about layers, and not just digging down to find the one meaning. But then, like Freud at his best, and of course Freud is not the be all and the end all of psychoanalysis, but Freud at his best is really interested in this kind of like multiplicity and layered aspect of dreaming, particularly. There's a really interesting echo in that phrase that I cited from Catherine Mansfield. So she talks about the mushroom growth of cheap psychoanalysis, but that mushroom growth I find really kind of uncannily reminiscent of this moment in the interpretation of dreams where Freud he describes a passage in even the most thoroughly interpreted dream, which has to be left obscure. This is because, he says, we become aware during the work of interpretation that at that point there is a tangle of dream thoughts which cannot be unraveled. This is the dream's navel, the spot where it reaches down into the unknown. The dream thoughts to which we are led by interpretation cannot have any definite endings. They are bound to branch out in every direction into the intricate network of our world of thought. It is at some point where this meshwork is particularly close that the dream wish grows up like a mushroom out of its mycelium. I'm so intrigued by that like strange echo, like she's being damning of this mushroom growth of cheap psychoanalysis, but Freud, the mushroom, stands in for these moments in dreams where you can't go any further. Like the psychoanalyst has to kind of bow down before the obscurity of the human mind. And those are all the moments that I find really interesting in Freud's writing. I would also say there's a kind of, because I have been talking too much probably about Freud, there's a whole tradition of psychoanalysis in Britain particularly that really is interested in paying tribute to those obscure moments. So the kind of psychoanalytic writing by writers like psychoanalysts like D.W. Winnicott and the more contemporary psychoanalyst Christopher Bollas, they're both really interested in respecting the kind of obscure parts of the human psyche and the ethics of not interpreting, not reading, like paying kind of tribute to a part of the patient that cannot be reached. No. Somebody asked me that in my job interview. And I had this moment where I thought, oh God, I could make something up, but I better not. And I just said no. I don't really. That maybe Lacan gets like one mention in my book, partly because there's a kind of historical part of my book and also my work more broadly that's about psychoanalysis in Britain.
Like the Centre for Freudian Analysis and Research in Britain is Lacanian, and most psychoanalysts globally are Lacanian, and Lacan himself said he was Freudian. And it's like a Freud v 2.0 correcting a lot. It's a dissenting culture in the UK, but globally, psychoanalysts are Lacanian.
Yeah.
And it's very intimately related with literature, fundamentally, semiotics.
But it's so interesting, the history of psychoanalysis, and it's always about like who's the most Freudian is this kind of struggle, which itself is very Freudian, to kind of get to lay claim to his legacy.
I always think Freud was the Newton, Lacan was the Einstein sort of thing.
Yeah.
Freud was a genius.
Yeah.
But around the edges, they were probably...
Definitely. Around the edges and right in the middle too. Yeah. But I mean, obviously I'm fascinated by Freud, otherwise I wouldn't be talking about him so much, but yeah, there are problems.
So the first chapter, you explore a fascinating tension between the idea of modernist literature as a difficult, supposedly mature mode of reading and modernist writers' persistent fascination with childhood and the figure of the child reader. As you note, both Woolf and Proust present scenes of childhood reading that, in their very strangeness, seem to puncture the familiar narratives of the child, either as the subject of sentimental education or as vulnerable to ideological manipulation, presenting childhood reading as an altogether more complex and nuanced experience. How do the readers play with and subvert conventional ideas about the child reader?
So both Woolf and Proust are fascinated, I think, by childhood and in particular by the figure of the child reader. And it was one of the first things that I really kind of kept encountering in this project was images of children reading in these books that are very much not aimed at children. There is a phenomenon of modernist literature written by modernist writers for children, but that's another thing. In Virginia Woolf's novel To the Lighthouse, the entire novel actually really, you don't quite necessarily see it at first, but the entire novel is staged around a central scene in which the mother figure, Mrs. Ramsay, sits in the window of this childhood holiday home reading Grimm's fairy tales to her son James. And that's there's this sort of tableau at the center of a mother reading to her child, reading fairy tales to her youngest child. And it's figured in quite almost nostalgic terms. It's this scene of like pleasure and intimacy and ease. Similarly for Proust, childhood reading is central to the childhood memories that animate his long novel À la recherche du temps perdu. There's this kind of famously epiphanic moment that you've probably all encountered where Proust's narrator, he dips this little Madeleine, the little French cake, into a cup of tea, and it unlocks all these memories that come rushing forth, surging forth. And this scene is really intimately connected to his own experiences of being read bedtime stories by his mother. So in Proust's writing too, this kind of childhood reading and being read to by the mother is really important. Proust has an essay on reading, and he writes in this that there are perhaps no days of our childhood that we lived as fully as the days we think we left behind without living at all, the days we spent with a favourite book. And so for both of them, they're really invested in this like primal scene of reading, either reading alone as a child or being read to by the mother. In some ways, both Proust and Woolf idealize this scene. It's kind of idyllic and idealized, but they're also quite, I think, self-aware of our tendency to idealize it. So where there seems to be a bit of a disconnect between the kind of evocation of like pleasure and comfort and ease and intimacy with the experience that you might have of reading a really long novel like The Recherche or The Waves or To the Lighthouse, I think that they're kind of playing with this scene and like evoking memories that we might have of reading as children, of escaping within the novel. There's a kind of an element of like they're interested in the connotations of escapism and refuge that we might have with childhood reading. And there's this kind of, I was interested in what this might mean in relationship to a set of discourses that often position these kind of quite difficult novels as novels that are for they're for kind of making us mature. And there's a discourse particularly in literary criticism that sort of says modernism will make you grown up. Modernism, she doesn't use the phrase modernism, but she's writing about what we now call modernist literature. And she says it demands that the reader respond as an adult. And again, she's like opposing it to like the infantile satisfactions of pop culture. So anyways, I was interested in this. Like we've got this discourse around like modernism as maturity. And then we've got all these scenes of children reading in these quite challenging, although pleasurable texts. And I wanted to think about what they were doing there and what Woolf and Proust might be suggesting about childhood and about reading. So Into the Lighthouse, I think that Woolf is actually, she's very self-conscious about our tendency to romanticize childhood and to romanticize childhood memories of reading. So although To the Lighthouse does kind of turn around this central scene of the mother reading to the child, she's also kind of staging the scene in a way that makes us think about our tendency to idealize it. So she has the artist in her novel, Lily Briscoe, is painting the scene too. And I could have a look at this scene itself. I can read you a line from it. So this artist, Lily Briscoe, who's a kind of a post-impressionist painter, a bit like Virginia Woolf's sister Vanessa Bell, and she's painting Mrs. Ramsay reading to James. And this other man, Mr. Banks, comes along and he takes out his penknife and he taps her canvas and he says, "What did she wish to indicate by the triangular purple shape just there?" And Lily responds, "It was Mrs. Ramsay reading to James," she said. She knew his objection, that no one could tell it for a human shape. But she had made no attempt at likeness, she said. Mr. Banks was interested. Mother and child, then, objects of universal veneration, might be reduced, he pondered, to a purple shadow without irreverence. So she's kind of producing this like almost abstract post-impressionist painting, the mother and child, these figures of veneration in a long tradition of painting, going back to like Raphael and prior to that, the kind of the Madonna and the child with a book. She's like rejecting that tradition and producing this purple triangle to depict the mother and child reading. I think that what Woolf is doing in this scene is sort of describing to us the painterly equivalent of what she does with her novel, and like asking us to think about what this kind of writing and this kind of painting demands that might be different to that kind of very intimate scene of mother and child absorbed in the world of Grimm's fairy tales.
It's trying to promote kind of a new type of recognition. It's the recognition of the obscure, like how we can all recognize, so recognition is not necessarily about fixed identity, but like recognition can be trying to promote us to recognize that obscurity is actually paradoxically a clearer recognition of that.
Yeah, like Into the Lighthouse, we've got Lily Briscoe making a painting that is in some way of Mrs. Ramsay reading to James, but not quite, as she puts it. She had made no attempt at likeness. So it's not meant to be a representation of them in that sense, but she also sees it as a kind of tribute to them. And she creates this painting as a purple triangular shape. And then later in the novel, or maybe it's earlier, I can't remember where it comes, Woolf describes Mrs. Ramsay herself feeling like she's a wedge-shaped core of darkness. And it's like Lily's painting with this purple triangle is a better way of paying tribute to Mrs. Ramsay's sense of herself as a wedge-shaped core of darkness. And it's when she feels herself as a wedge-shaped core of darkness that she feels liberated from her responsibilities as this beautiful middle-class mother who is in that role very confined. And like you're saying, Chris, there's a kind of perhaps a freedom in the darkness.
I am I always since reading Bassani's Culture of Redemption, I'm always wary that I'm getting into that kind of thing again, where art is supposed to have a more accurate representation of reality, when really that's actually something that we as a culture are keep on repeating, this kind of longing for redemption, and that art is kind of this redemption. It doesn't have to be about redemption. It can be more about what I think around, how I think around it is it's more about critique, because there's something about reality that it's trying to critique as opposed to save us from.
Yeah. I think I have a lot of thoughts about Bassani and redemption. Yeah. And so Leo Bassani's The Culture of Redemption is criticizing what he sees as a modernist tendency to think of art as something that might redeem us from history and time, and like a kind of escapist version of thinking about art and literature. And I think in the kinds of scenes that I'm tracking in modernist writing, a lot of modernist writers were themselves wary of that, is what I'm arguing in response to him, that there's already a kind of anxiety about when it might be kind of irresponsible to turn to art as a refuge from our reality, whilst recognizing the desire that we might have to find that refuge.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? I really love Leo Bassani's work. Yeah. And what I want to do is find a way of thinking about how we can recognize real human desire for escape at times of darkness, whilst also recognizing when it might be wrong to actually try and escape the realities that we live in.
Is there also an element of play? Is there something about the child reader is very playful and the modernist reader is also very playful?
Yeah. Yes. Definitely. When you're invited into a modernist text, you're being invited to play, I think. Yeah.
I often feel when I'm writing, especially when I'm writing something really difficult, I'm often kind of giggling while I'm doing it because it's so absurd to try and read this. I think that actually maybe some of the hard things are actually just jokes. Yeah. That what looks like it's a really hard, impenetrable text might just be it's a really elaborate joke. Doing some work at the weekend on Lewis Carroll, and I realised that he also wrote a play that was a defence of Euclidean geometry, but he turned it into a play. And I like that. That's almost just that playfulness of.
There is something very earnest about what modernists were trying to do, which is there was a brief period, where people believed that the word could change the world. They believed that. And they believed that in like a very deep, intrinsic kind of way. And there is something deeply earnest about that drive, right? That the word can change the world. That politics and literature and art can all converge and can make a different place, right? That maybe leads into the culture of redemption. It's not just, I've always read it not so much, although not divorced from escapism, but also that art can redeem a fallen humanity. It makes it all art is what makes it all worthwhile. Right? So it's not, surely escapism, I think, I can hear it's a part of what I'm saying, but it's also just that we can justify all the badness of humanity because we can make these things that are so full of beauty and truth and all those kinds of terms that have been constantly chipped away at through the 20th century, but were really, really believed in at that time.
Freud writes this essay on, this really small essay on transience, and he describes going for a walk in the countryside with a poet, written during the First World War, and they're reflecting, the poet is kind of really sad about the transience of the beauty of the natural world. And then there's this big break on the page, like there's a kind of, it's not just a paragraph break, but there's a couple of lines break. And then he writes about how the First World War kind of, except it's not called the First World War at that point, it's the war, swept through this kind of beautiful kind of landscape and like destroyed everything. And then Freud, in this really weird move, suddenly sort of insists that actually it's fine because the riches of civilization will be rebuilt. And like, even though it's all been destroyed, we'll build it all up again and everything will be okay. And it's kind of this it's like, you can see how much he wants that to be true, but you don't really even believe it as you read him. Everything can just be rebuilt on the same basis, because for modernist writers, that First War really destroyed that sense, or destroyed any belief in the riches of civilization, which is the phrase that is used in the translation of Freud. A belief that we can be redeemed through art is present for a lot of modernist writers, and one that Bassani is very, very critical of.
I also read this book as challenging the idea of modernism as necessarily highbrow. By reading the best-selling romance novels of Ethel M. Dell alongside Woolf and Proust, you open up a more complicated picture than the one often maintained by defenders of high culture. In what ways might Dell be doing something similar to Woolf, and how might she be more complex and more nuanced than she is often given credit for?
I'm going to ask, has anybody ever come across Ethel M. Dell? No. Okay, so as I worked on this project, I kept coming across a figure called Ethel M. Dell. She just appears again and again and again in literary criticism, critical writings from the 1920s and 1930s. I don't think many people read Dell now, except for me. Although when I mentioned Ethel M. Dell to my husband's grandparents, they did know of her. And she was an enormously popular, best-selling romance novelist from she first started publishing in the 1910s, and she published through till her death in around 1940. So she was an enormously popular novelist, and she appears repeatedly in literary criticism from the time. The reason I kept coming across her is that her best-selling novels were condemned repeatedly by critics, including Q.D. Leavis and George Orwell, and they're always condemned, and this is interesting for Exploding Appendix, they're always condemned in like these kind of gustatory terms as bad diet. So Q.D. Leavis condemns her as detrimental diet. She's described as suet pudding to be sucked down by addicted female readers. So she appears again and again, and like imagined readers appear again and again in literary criticism from the time as bad diet and detrimental diet, bad food, kind of addictive stuff, like fattening up these gross, like female glutton figures, how her readers are imagined. And so I was intrigued, and I went away and started reading Ethel M. Dell. And what I was fascinated to find, given that she's constantly described in these very like gustatory terms, is that in her first novel, The Way of an Eagle, which was published in 1912, the opening meeting between the hero and the heroine actually takes the form of a violent encounter on the very opening pages, in which the heroine, who we know is already addicted to opium, which she drinks orally, in the opening scene, she is violently and forcibly drugged by the man who we also know, because we know the kind of genre we're in, she will come to love and marry at the close of the novel. So I was really struck with this woman who's always imagined as like bad diet and kind of addiction. At the very opening of her first novel, stages this scene in which a woman who's addicted to opium is forcibly drugged with opium by the man that actually by the end of the novel, we know she's going to come to like love and marry. And so what I do in this book is I explore the historical reverberations between Dell's scene of forcible drugging and the contemporary accounts of suffragette forcible feeding. The accounts of suffragette forcible feeding were being published around the same time as Dell wrote her first novel. And there are really interesting, I think anyway, resonances between how Dell writes about her character being kind of like pinned down and forced to consume opium, and the ways in which suffragettes at the time were writing about being forcibly fed when they were taking part in hunger strikes. So what I do in the book is I say, I think that there's something going on in Dell's writing which stages a set of questions about women's agency, hunger, and desires that really complicate and even trouble the critics' insistence that these novels just straightforwardly kind of engendered passive forms of degenerate and engorged femininity in the readers. I'm not exactly like rescuing Dell's novels or trying to claim her as a radical champion of women's desires. Her novels are pretty dreadfully bound up in particularly imperialist fantasies from the time, and they have really kind of troubling gender politics in all sorts of ways. But they're also kind of strange, and in the way that like so often popular culture does, they're kind of over-determined, or they're registering like an unease in the culture of the time about gender and about race and about sexuality. So what I'm suggesting is that Dell was more complex than she's given a credit for. And I want to suggest in particular that the women and the men who read Dell's novels had more complex fantasy lives than straightforward critiques of popular culture allow. So I'm interested in getting away from the kind of beating up of readers of popular novels. And well, like one of the things, so I read quite a lot of these novels. I don't discuss all of them, but I discussed that first novel, and I also discussed briefly I think it's her penultimate novel. So in Dell's penultimate novel, The Juice of the Pomegranate is called, which was published in 1938. She includes this really self-conscious scene in which her protagonist, Diana, spots a copy of an Ethel M. Dell novel hidden behind a cushion on her sister's sofa. And Diana pulls the book out and she exclaims, "Blanche, you're a snob and I'm going to punish you for it. I shall put this book where all your..." Like she's a figure, like she's detested by all the like the snobs and the elitists and the highbrows, and she's just, I mean, she's having a laugh. Like she'd become incredibly wealthy by this point. Her books were made into films. I don't think she particularly cared that they didn't like her, but she was aware of it, and she like. So one of the things I'm interested in is she too is like she's performing her own scene of like non-reading the book hidden behind the sofa. Then like to give you a kind of the summary of like the plot of this novel in this scene. So Diana, she discovers this book tucked away behind a cushion on her sister's sofa, an Ethel M. Dell book. She sort of remarks upon this, and then she goes out dancing. She's plied with alcohol. She's seduced. And as we later find out, although the terms of the novel are slightly different, she's drugged and she's raped by the villain, who is then revealed to be her stepbrother and who convinces her to marry him after he finds out about the fact that she is pregnant. They are married. He takes her to France, where he bullies her and abuses her while conducting clandestine business as the paid agent of a foreign secret service. When the hero turns up to rescue her, Diana's husband tries to run him over in a car, at which Diana grabs the wheel, leading to an accident in which her husband is killed. So it does away with the villain. Diana suffers a miscarriage and is life-threateningly injured, but after many months recovers to marry her hero. So that's a kind of précis of the novel. But in the scene following what is not described in these terms, but what is a rape scene, Diana quarrels with her sister for insisting on the virtues of married life. And this is where Dell's kind of self-consciousness about her own position in kind of high culture appears again. And Diana complains to her sister, "You married people all know the varied ingredients that go to make up the matrimonial mixture, and yet you always try to serve it up as if it were sheer treacle and nothing else." And then Blanche, who's the kind of clandestine reader of Ethel M. Dell novels, says, "The true way of happiness should be first the dream, then fulfillment, and after that, the awakening." And in response, Diana sarcastically asks Blanche if she plucked the narrative straight out of an Ethel M. Dell novel. So there's this kind of like self-awareness about her, how she's being satirized by highbrow writers, critics, people like George Orwell and Q.D. Leavis. But like this also, I think she's also saying this isn't just sheer treacle. It's not, there's something about these novels that appealed to many, many readers. I like to put it very simply. I'd like to kind of find a way of respecting those readers and like respect the complexity of people's fantasy lives, like we were just saying. And maybe things have shifted a bit, but we do all consume all sorts of different types of culture. And it's not, what you do when you're reading for escape is not necessarily simple. And maybe, but also maybe sometimes it is, and that's okay. That's sort of why I wanted to turn to Dell. And I found all sorts of interesting things when I read her.
Because it's almost like thinking about like Douglas Sirk films were treated as like
No.
imitation of life. They're just like films you'd go to cry
Right.
for. But they were like the 50s and actually dealing with lots of like imitation of life is about sort of racism in America. But actually at the time, they later got venerated and they influenced people like, Godard and Fassbinder and stuff like that. Actually at the time, and so there's a lot of things that really influence a kind of sort of avant-garde or modernist kind of literature, but are at the time often treated as just women's weeping.
Yeah. And I was trying to, like you said, kind of challenge the high-low, and I'm not the first to have done it, but like challenge that kind of high-low divide. But also think about, so there's a whole strand of literary criticism that's really interested in women's romance reading as staging forms of protest. So there's a famous book by a critic called Janice Radway called Reading the Romance, where she conducts a kind of like a sociological study of Mills and Boon readers. And she argues that even if the plots of these kind of Mills and Boon romance fiction are reactionary and patriarchal, the act of reading itself can still be viewed as a kind of protest, because the act of reading and the act of is it itself an attempt to escape from the kind of deadly confines of the patriarchal household. So you can read the process of reading and of trying to find escape in these kind of novels as itself like a refusal, maybe not a refusal of, but an attempt to escape from like patriarchal norms. So I was interested in that kind of tradition.
Drawing specifically on Virginia Woolf's The Waves, you explore how the themes of redemption and mourning are more complex in her work than critics often acknowledge. You suggest that Woolf's depiction of mourning aligns more closely with Freud's conception of melancholia than with his model of mourning, and also the cyclical rhythms found in Melanie Klein's theory of mourning and reparation. Could you speak a little bit about how these psychoanalytic theories help us better understand Woolf's writing?
In a way, I think that my argument here is not so much about how these psychoanalytic theories can help us to better understand Woolf, but how reading Woolf might help us to, or may complicate our understanding of the psychoanalytic writing. Like one of the ways that I approach reading literature and psychoanalysis alongside each other is to try to read them like alongside each other rather than like applying the psychoanalytic text to the literary. And I actually often think that reading writers like Woolf or Proust alongside Freud, they can help us to like complicate Freud or like speak back to him in some ways. So we've touched upon this a bit, talking about like the idea of redemption earlier. And I was talking about Freud's essay on transient. So I'll say a bit about Freud's thinking about mourning and melancholia. So during the First World War, Freud wrote a trio of essays, all of which are engaging with ideas about death and mourning and what he theorizes as melancholia. So he writes an essay called On Transience, an essay called Mourning and Melancholia, and another called Thoughts for the Times on War and Death. And in these essays, he poses a model of mourning, which we're probably all familiar with because it's a very popular account of how we think about mourning to this day. He proposes a model of mourning as a kind of psychological work with a beginning, a middle, and an end. In these essays, Freud, he's kind of forging a theory of mourning that insists on the individual's capacity to overcome their grief for what has been lost and to replace the lost object with something else. And one of the really interesting things he does in his essay on mourning and melancholia is he also is interested in not just in what we do when we lose a person, but he talks about how we might grieve for, and this is his phrase, how we might be grieving for some abstraction, such as one's country, liberty, an ideal, and so on, is his phrase. So he's interested in how people might be grieving certain ideas about one's country or one's nation. He's writing this in the midst of the First World War. So he's thinking about how we might grieve the loss of certain kinds of ideal. And he contrasts what he calls the normal work of mourning with the pathological state of melancholia. So Freud argues that in melancholia, the individual clings to what they've lost, kind of transforms their original kind of connection to this loved object, like whether it's a person or an idea about the country or the nation. This becomes transformed into, and this is his phrase, the identification of the ego with the abandoned object. So in mourning, the mourner progresses through what he says is a very painful process, but it's a process in which the person gradually consents to what he calls, and this is his phrase, the command of reality. So he's like, gradually, it's very, very painful, but you loosen your ties to what's been lost and you let go and you obey the commands of reality. Although the mourner might experience, and does experience usually, a kind of internal revolt against this, bit by bit, this is his phrase, at great expense of time and cathectic energy, let's just call it energy, the ties to what has been lost are severed, and when the work of mourning is completed, the ego becomes free and uninhibited again. So he has this model that we lose something, we grieve for it, it's very, very painful, this pathological state of melancholia, where he says that the shadow of the object, of the thing that we've lost, falls upon the ego, like ourself, producing a painful and a kind of prolonged relationship to what's been lost. So he's at pains to distinguish these two processes. And in these essays, the work of mourning, as I suggested earlier, is bound up with a theory about art's capacity to rebuild a shattered civilization. So I think he's also interested in how we might turn to art as something that replaces what we've lost. And again, I'm really interested in how he thinks that, say, you've lost an ideal about your nation at a time of war, is then really important that you can use art to rebuild the things that you've lost. So like T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, famously has this line about shoring up ruins with fragments. And I think Freud is interested in the same kind of aesthetics of shoring up the ego with the kind of fragments of European culture. Now, Jacqueline Rose, a critic who's been really influential for me in many ways. She was my PhD supervisor. So she's argued that the theory of mourning that can be read as, and this is her term, a drive for political, cultural, as much as psychic self-protection, which is born out of a moment of cultural dismay. So she's basically, what she's saying is Freud's writing in the midst of war at a moment when everything that he's held dear to him, the idea of nation and of civilization, it's all kind of imperiled. And so he needs a theory of mourning whereby you can get over it, to put it very simply, and where art might give you something to hold on to at a time of terrible, terrible loss. And Freud himself he's a kind of slightly aware of this. In his essay, Thoughts for the Times on War on Death, he points out that the sheer mass of death in the First World War, he suggests might be bringing about a very different relationship to death. He talks about how in the unconscious, we find it really hard to believe in death. A psychoanalyst who I know put this to me really well, where he talked about how often patients say, if I die. No, it's not an if. But unconsciously, we find it really hard to imagine our own deaths. But Freud suggested in his essay on Thoughts of the Times on War of Death, he says, well, actually, maybe the kind of piling up of the bodies might begin to change our kind of perception of death. So it's a time where he's really kind of thinking about death and grief and mourning and the role of arts and culture in response to this. And so he produces this theory that in some ways seems a bit too simple. And I think Freud is one of the figures in this book that we've been talking about, Leo Bassani's The Culture of Redemption. So Leo Bassani's The Culture of Redemption is a book in which he views both modernist writers and psychoanalysts as kind of complicit in theorizing an idea of art as something that can redeem us from the kind of traumas of history. And Freud is one of the figures that he's critical of, but he's also particularly critical of another psychoanalyst who I've been talking about, Melanie Klein, who develops an entire theory of reparation that Bassani sees as kind of exemplary of this modernist faith in art as redemption. I won't go into too much detail here about Melanie Klein, but what I argue in the book is that both Virginia Woolf and Melanie Klein are interested in the relationship between violence and destruction and the role that art and literature play in relationship to these, whether by offering solace or refuge or reparation, or by offering just a space in which to process and reflect on violence and destruction. So my chapter on The Waves, which is, as I've mentioned, one of Woolf's most strange, most poetic, most abstract books. It's a novel that she describes as a kind of play poem. It takes the form of 6 voices, which the voices of 6 characters. She doesn't use the phrase characters though. They're 6 figures who we follow from early childhood, 3 female characters, 3 male characters. We follow them from early childhood into adulthood, and they all speak in these kind of like, they're a bit like soliloquies, and they just speak, and there's no real narrator. The narrator just says like, Bernard said, Ginny said, she said, he said. And their soliloquies that are spoken in the first person are interspersed with these interludes, which track the rising and the falling of the sun over the course of a day. And we follow these characters from childhood into adulthood. Nothing really happens, except that one character who doesn't speak, their friend Percival, who goes off and becomes a colonial administrator in India, he dies. So they all worship him as a kind of hero figure. And he's this kind of figure of like masculine imperialist valor and splendor. And he goes off to India and he dies, and they all mourn for him. And when they're mourning for him, they all turn to books, to paintings, and to art to kind of try and find a space in which to mourn. So one of the things that I'm arguing in this book is that when Woolf shows us all these characters, whether it's Bernard sitting in the National Gallery or Rhoda reading the poetry of Percy Bysshe Shelley, they're all kind of using art and literature to kind of perform an act of mourning. But I think that what Woolf is doing is asking us to like be mindful of the ways in which all these different kinds of ideas about what it means to turn to art and literature in the wake of loss or grief. Like, she's asking us to just be mindful of how those fantasies of art as a kind of escape or redemption might be informing our own processes of reading. So I'm saying that, like, I think that Woolf thinks that we can find forms of solace, but that she is wary of the ways in which those ideas of art as escape might be kind of complicit with more like ethically or politically evasive ways of thinking about art.
So I really loved your account of Marion Milner's diaristic and deeply personal psychoanalytic writings. I really found myself wanting to read them immediately. I was also struck by your suggestion that Milner might be understood not as a psychoanalyst, not only as a psychoanalyst, but also as a modernist writer. Both Milner and Woolf, you note, explore the question, what do I like, in a way that isn't simply celebratory, but also fraught with anxiety, particularly in a moment when individual desires are deeply entangled with what you describe as capitalist mass deception and fascist demagogues. Could you say a bit more about how the question of subjectivity and interior life becomes sites of critical inquiry in the work of both Woolf and Milner?
Thanks, Bradley. I'm so pleased that you were also inspired by Marion Milner. She's a really fascinating writer. And so have any of you encountered Marion Milner before? No. She was born in 1900 and she trained as a Montessori teacher originally. She went to UCL and did a degree in, I'm going to get it wrong, it's one of those PPP kind of degrees where she did like psychology and philosophy. And she worked with Cyril Burt, who you might have heard of before. He was the infamous founder of IQ testing. He was also a eugenicist. She got a first-class degree in psychology and she won a scholarship to go to Harvard, where she worked on like psychology, like industrial psychology. At the same time, she was teaching in the Workers' Educational Association in London. So she was a teacher. She worked for the Girls' Day School Trust, which is a kind of private girls' school trust. They still run private girls' schools, like Brighton Girls' School. Today, she did kind of like psychological experiment. Like, that sounds a bit sinister, actually. No, she just sort of worked with students in these schools and published a book about that. But in the 30s, whilst she was in America, while she was in Harvard, she underwent some psychoanalysis with a Jungian psychoanalyst who'd been recommended to her by Virginia Woolf's sister-in-law. And she starts to think about training as a psychoanalyst and starts reading a lot of psychoanalysis. And she writes these 2 books, which are sort of informed by that process of beginning to think about and beginning to train as a psychoanalyst. But they are not psychoanalysts' books. That one of them is called A Life of One's Own, which she published that in 1934. And the other book, published in 1937, is called An Experiment in Leisure. And A Life of One's Own obviously has echoes of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. She doesn't actually cite that book. She does cite Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, and she was sort of peripherally connected to Virginia Woolf via her sister-in-law and her brother. Like, they kind of move in similar circles, but if you look at her notebooks, you can see her kind of anxiety around the Bloomsbury set. So she feels a bit like an outsider in relationship to them. And she writes these 2 books as experiments in attempting to answer this very simple question, what do I like? And she's interested in trying to figure out what it is that gives her joy and pleasure in life. Like, what does she really want to do with her leisure time? And what are the conditions in which we feel pleasure? So she's interested in, she says that she publishes these books that are in some ways very, very personal, and they involve her kind of going over these experiments with writing out lists, diary entries, experimenting with kinds of free writing and free association, drawings, doodles. She publishes extracts from these diaries and notebooks, and she kind of trawls over them, trying to figure out, like, where are the moments where I really felt joy or pleasure or interest in something. But she says, I didn't publish these books to tell you about my life. And actually, they're not autobiographies at all. She hides some of the details of her lives. She says that the reason she publishes them is that she's trying to give the reader access to a method for finding out what he or she really wants themselves. And so she's giving us a method for trying to find our own likes, in contrast to the things that are forced upon us. They kind of, what's her phrase she uses? I've written down here. She says that this is offering us a method for freeing the reader from borrowed, mass-produced ideals, the things that are kind of forced upon us, the things that we're told we should like. And as the 30s kind of wear on, those borrowed, mass-produced ideals also become the kinds of things that fascist dictators might be telling us that we want or that we desire. And so she's really interested in how to try to, like, rescue the self, and particularly the female self, from what everyone else is telling us we should be or want or like. And as the 30s move on, that question, like, what do I like, becomes much more urgent. So she's writing about this against the backdrop of a rising current of nationalism and fascism. And there's a kind of new urgency when it gets to 1937. She writes the end of that book in Spain on the eve of the Spanish Civil War. She's trying to think about how to kind of rescue the self from fascism, really. In this 1937 book, An Experiment in Leisure, which she completed in Spain on the eve of the Spanish Civil War, she tracks her own fascination with witchcraft, with pagan rituals of submission and abandon. She talks about her experience of going to witness bullfights in Spain, and she says that it's like the most religious experience of her life, witnessing a bullfight. She's like stuff in common with other famous modernist writers like Hemingway there, of course. But she then she has this moment, though, where she's been tracking her own kind of esoteric interest in witchcraft and paganism and abandon. And then suddenly she worries because she sees that what she has thought are her, like, most personal, most intimate desires are also being appropriated in Nazi iconography of the time. So there's a lot of Nazi appropriation of paganism and witchcraft at this time. And she suddenly really worries that what she thinks she's set out on this method of trying to find out, like, her own deeply personal interest. And then she's like, oh, but actually all these fascists are, like, dancing around maypoles as well. And so she has this kind of panic, but then she kind of attempts to rescue it by making a case for this whole process of like keeping notebooks and doing doodles and drawings and writing things, creating things, but in very small everyday ways. Like, this is not like writing the masterpiece. As you can probably tell, I'm just fascinated by Milner and by this particular project that she starts at this point. She then becomes a psychoanalyst in the early 1940s. She's most famous perhaps for a book that she published in 1950 called On Not Being Able to Paint, which is much more about doodling and drawing as a way of accessing this kind of, like, inner self. And she becomes very famous within British psychoanalysis for her more psychoanalytic writing. But she's also a painter and makes collages out of her own paintings too. And so I'm working on another project now about Milner, Woolf and Doris Lessing as creators of what Woolf calls notebook literature, as a way of investing in small acts of, like, individual creativity as a way of finding agency.
You talked about earlier about, like, that you're quite against this, the high and the low. And, like, what you're saying is, like, reminding me that, like, you know, you can be creative and, like, it doesn't matter if it's just notebooks or doodling, it's like, you know, rubbish in the eyes of, like, a kind of, you know, mass market or something, or even, like, highbrow. You know, even that in its own way is, like, still as valid, or I don't want to use the term valuable really, but, like, it's incredibly, like, liberating and just wonderful to do. Really like a way of self-acceptance and a way of accepting everything. Like we were saying earlier on with Cunard's poem, where there's this moment in Cunard's poem Parallax, who says, this is what you have to do. You have to accept everything, even if it's only so that you can pay attention or something like that along those lines. And I find that that's really feeding into what you're saying more broadly, is that like there's this, it makes me think about like what the enemy really is, right? We have this like notion in culture, I think, that the enemy might be like reality TV, or the enemy might be like artwork or that isn't good enough to be published, or like isn't good enough to be like to entertain. And we have this kind of inhibition of thinking that that's the enemy, when really the enemy is actually like much more directly to do with like money and power and that kind of stuff.
And I wonder whether that's why zines are having like a moment.
Zines are notebooks in a way.
Yeah. It's a kind of like a way of trying to claim space and agency and working collaboratively. Yeah.
I'm a bit concerned about the way that we're playing loose and fast with backwards and forwards in time between modernism, history, present. And so making some of these judgments is problematic. Modernism is progressive in its thinking. Contemporary art doesn't think. So going backwards and forwards in this way is tricky for me to hear how you think about now framed in a modernist perspective.
It goes back to that question of what we mean by modernism, doesn't it? Because a lot of people would say that modernism was reactionary and not progressive. It depends what. It all good. This is partly why when you, Bradley, when you were asking me about that, how I define modernism, it's really important. It's really difficult though as well, isn't it? Because, and also this is like when we come from slightly different disciplinary backgrounds, I get the impression that in some contexts I could talk about modernism. I'm a scholar of literature mainly, but in some contexts where I talk about modernist literature, and I'm referring to Virginia Woolf and James Joyce and Proust, there's an association of a certain kind of like literary form of writing that's breaking out of conventional forms, and that is associated with a kind of liberation, and that could have a progressive politics attached to it, or a liberatory politics attached to it.
Freud is the person that called psychoanalysis, which is liberating the psyche, the soul, butterfly. It's the same word in Greek. Lysis is release, psyche is butterfly. There's always that sense of release, isn't there?
But that can also be dangerous, the release of what is violent and destructive and horrid within us. And that is also a strand of what we would also call modernist literature, which involves very bad politics. Pound is a person that's come up at points. There are many modernist writers and avant-garde writers who have extremely bad politics.
Something Bradley said earlier I thought was really, when he's talking about playfulness, it made me think of Wyndham Lewis, who again, there's bad associations, but his vorticist magazine Blast, the typesetting and that, I never thought of those. It is actually playful, but again, breaking patterns. And there's humour, which passes through it. I'm a musician, so it passes through into The Fall. The lyrics of The Fall are very influenced by Wyndham Lewis, and there's always a sense of humour and satire in there. But I thought that was quite a profound point to the playfulness, because it can come across as a po-faced, elitist, which I love it actually, it's an area I like, but there is that playfulness there as well, isn't there?
I also wonder if there's a sense in which history, when we look back at periods of the past, like the Renaissance or ancient Greece, we think of these quite long periods, whereas we think of things like, quite often we've been taught to think of like modernism as this very short period. And it seems to be, if we looked at it from the past, maybe we'd still be thinking that modernism only just started. That it's actually, there's a lot further to go.
I'm so interested in the intersections between modernist literature and like the progressive education movement. That's one of the other things that Virginia and Leonard Woolf were publishing at the Hogarth Press, were like tracts on progressive education, and that there's a big intersection with psychoanalysis. There are lots of the psychoanalysts that I'm working on where, like Marion Milner, engaged in things like Montessori teaching or experimenting with alternative modes of education.
Didn't Rudolf Steiner and Freud have the same teacher?
Don't know.
Yeah, I believe they did. And Husserl, they all had the same teacher as an Italian, like, radical theologian or something. I can't remember his name.
There are lots of intersections there.
Yeah.
I always find I end up wanting to be like uber specific Because the you raise a really important point about not eliding the differences between...
Totally agree. And I think it is very, you use the term discipline specific.
Milner has this idea of what she calls expressive action. So she says towards the end of one of those first two books, I can't remember now which one, she says something like, I'm not suggesting that we all become minor poets or all go and exhibit in the local art gallery, but that small acts of and she uses the term welding, and she talks about small acts of welding, I'm going to get the quotation wrong, and small acts of kind of creating are nonetheless forms of what she calls expressive action. And she's juxtaposing, she's sort of engaging with a set of debates that are specific to a particular historical moment, the 1930s, where people are saying, terrible things are happening. What can we do? What can we do? And but then that speaks to the present a lot too, that feeling that we have of, I feel helpless. What can I do? Can I do
an act of defiance in a way?
Yeah.
The smallest act of creativity.
Yeah. But she's also resisting a move that also happens in the 30s, which is very much appropriated on the far right, particularly in Britain. To put it really simply, Oswald Mosley, before he forms the British Union of Fascists, forms the New Party, and their journal is called Action. And it's all about saying, we will offer you action, we will do something. So these writers I'm interested in, and she talks, both Woolf and Milner use the phrase, they talk about the man of action, and they're kind of rejecting that, but trying to figure out an alternative form of action that's kind of related to creativity. And so she talks about... she does talk in her 1950 book about the revolutionary, and she uses that word, potential of an education in creativity. And that's where her training as a Montessori teacher is sort of at work. She's interested in how creativity and education might provide what she calls an education for a democracy. So she's interested in how creativity might be part of education for democratic citizens. This is part of the utopian project that Sarah was referring to earlier. You could probably see why I'm interested in it today, but I'm also wanting to respect what you're saying about, let's think about the continuities and the differences between then and now.
In your conclusion, you draw thought-provoking parallels between the threat of fascism faced by early 20th century modernists and the challenges of our own so-called post-truth era. In what ways can modernist literature help us think through our current moment?
This is what we're talking about, really, is what does modernism mean for us now? The modernism that I'm talking about is this quite a literary form of modernism, albeit a literary form of modernism that's interested in writing about engagements with the visual arts as well. In this book on reading, and in the project that I'm working on now, I'm interested in how modernist writers and artists have thought about creativity and cultural encounters as a way of finding creative and critical agency. Marion Milner's become a really important thinker and writer for me because of the way that she links these kinds of everyday forms of creativity, notebooks, diaries, doodles, collages, with an argument about creativity and democratic education. And I think that is an idea at the heart of a lot of modernist literature from the 20s and 30s, is this idea that our engagements, whether as kind of creators, as artists and writers, or as readers and spectators, whether these kinds of creative encounters might provide a kind of education in democratic feeling and belonging. Yeah, I mean, I've got some notes here that I made in response to that question.
That's a nerdy question. What do you define as democracy?
Oh, no, I know. That's not a nerdy. Yeah.
Democracy is really confusing at the moment.
Yeah, yes. It is. I don't think I can answer it.
Sorry, I just wondered if you had
It's an important question.
Would you define it differently from Milner's time to now?
Yeah.
Because I see it as a very shifting thing based on politics and media, because you have to have a well-informed populace, and how that information is passed shifts. So our current interpretation shifts as our media shifts. And is democracy just a utopian ideal that can be achieved or not?
I suppose it's also, there's there's representational democracy, there's associative democracy, and then there's direct or participatory democracy. So there's different registers on which to think about, or different types of democracy to be thinking about.
Because a capitalist democracy is very different to a socialist democracy because of the market morphing its own thing as its own intelligence, as its own kind of top down or bottom up, feeding into this idea of the word democracy.
I'm always a bit suspicious of that. Like, it's almost too easy, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And because, like I was trying to say earlier, about, like, there are a lot of modernist writers who exercise their freedom to vocalize really troubling.
But is that not democracy?
Yeah.
I'd love to add to that point. I think this is really interesting, the way the conversation has gone this way. And I think it's credit to you, Helen, actually, for introducing both sides of this kind of like cliche, almost trope argument of, you know, where like ivory tower academia is and where we kind of actualize that in terms of radicalizing accessible spaces for people to access education and the arts in the modern world. So I have a kind of background where I came from like a working class background, and then 15 years ago when Brad and I met, we were studying like philosophy together, and then I went into social health care for a while. And then kind of in my mid-30s, having taken a step back from both and now become a struggling artist again. Yay! Financial devolution. But like it's really interesting for me because I see that I've been on both sides of this. Like, it's really interesting how kind of what you would call highbrow academia in the most kind of cliche sense can inform psychotherapeutic services. And then when I've been studying and working in psychotherapeutic services, how they seem so malinformed in a way by high-level academia, and there seems to be no middle ground at the moment. But the middle ground, I think, is especially difficult at the moment because of what someone just said. In the last 20 years, we've seen such a degradation in terms of the funding for arts. So we have this kind of split, I think, at the moment, which is like ginormous. And it was really interesting for me sometimes because when I was studying psychotherapy, for example, and working in psychotherapy, I'd be like, oh, Freud. Because it was just so elongated from the reality of having a patient in front of you every day, like hour after hour after hour after intense psychotherapy training. And then when I was there in that space, if I was over in the more academic space, you know, and someone was like, well, Freud doesn't matter so much in psychotherapeutic spaces because, you know, we're not really using that as an implementation to help like young people in CAMS in the NHS, for example. So, you know, I feel like the two have never met. And in the middle is kind of like a capitalistic void of, you know, how do you make yourself accessible to capitalism? Like for me, this is how the conversation of how the importance of the arts continues. I think there needs to be like a meeting. I don't know. I would just love to see more of like, Helen, what you've touched on in this amazing conversation. Thank you so much, by the way. I would love to see more of how we kind of take that incredible, let's stereotype it for what people who cannot access it say it is, ivory tower stuff, and like put it into the actual everyday implementation of psychotherapeutic services and the democratic process in the UK, including how people have access to the arts, which is so incredibly important for their psychological well-being and their freedom.
I've been trying to persuade various bodies to give me some funding to support a project that I'm working on that would evolve. So I've been talking with the Freud Museum about running some like CPD, continuing professional development sessions with mental health practitioners, like using Marion Milner's like notebooking, collaging, scrapbooking methods, and then running sessions with clinicians and then sessions with mental health service users to try to like workshop these ideas in a way that I think is what you're sort of suggesting here, to try and make these worlds meet. But I need somebody to fund me to do it because also there's a big degradation even within the ivory tower at the moment. Like Sussex definitely doesn't feel like an ivory tower at the moment, and I don't think many British universities do. So trying to kind of find spaces in which to speak across these barriers is difficult. But then this is a great space.
Yeah, it is a great space. Do you know what? I know psychotherapists that would bite your hand off for that. Honestly, especially those working in creative fields like art therapy, music therapy, alternative therapies. But when I studied it, it was all very kind of by the book. You know, it was kind of like, oh, Freud, Melanie, Klein. Then we're going to, you know what I mean? We're going to sit like, and I like Bowlby. And I kind of felt like it was trying to focus on the implementation of actually having a very vulnerable person in front of you that probably wouldn't understand a lot of what we're talking about today.
My other job is working as a care support worker with adults with learning disabilities who are all non-verbal. And I had a discussion about with what I suggested with work taking over one of the team meetings the other day. And we did loads of exercises around trying to put ourselves into the position of the service users, but also using some theoretical tradition. So I drew on phenomenology and rhythm analysis to sort of try and get us to think about how do we communicate with people that don't necessarily have a language or even a set of signs to communicate with us. But I felt like it was such a fun way to take over the meeting, and I think the staff members that were there seemed to enjoy that whole process of being able to step back from the job of being care workers for a bit, start to think slightly differently about actually what we're doing in our jobs in the daily life.
I found some bits in my notes that might. So one of the things that I think is interesting about Milner and one of the reasons I continue to think psychoanalysis, really broadly defined, is valid and helpful for thinking about the present, is that it's about encountering these irrational elements that I think are really powerful in ourselves and in our society. One of the things that really resonates with me reading Milner now is this moment in her book, An Experiment in Leisure, when she's just recounted her shock and her kind of distress when she realizes that her own interest in witchcraft and pagan rituals of abandon bear this kind of really disturbing resemblance to fascist appeals to the iconography of ritual and pagan ritual particularly. But then she still holds fast, and she insists that this kind of prevailing in the 1930s, but also I think now to some extent insistence that we must kind of fight totalitarian irrationalism with democratic reason. She says it's failed. So that kind of insistence, no, we've just got to be reasonable about this. It doesn't work. So she says we are continually reading, I'm quoting her here, we are continually reading of how democracy demands that all of us should think more clearly, reason more adequately about public affairs. But it has in recent years been proved that the inborn reasoning capacity of most of us is not very high. And then she cites a review by Aldous Huxley of a book that, as she puts it, expounded the racial beliefs of Nazi Germany. And then she goes on to kind of draw out the ways in which this insistence on democratic reason and rationality has kind of failed. And it's not just that it doesn't work, it's that it kind of leaves this gap where these kind of raging passions of the nationalist, they just burn even stronger. The more you just say, be rational, be reasonable, the kind of irrational just keeps burning. I find that really resonant now, this kind of her sense of the failure of democratic reason. And she writes that she's struck by Aldous Huxley's observation that, and she quotes him, the attempt to replace passion and prejudice by reason is in the face of modern nationalism absurd. And then she says, was it not possible that Freud was right and that man's discovery of reason had, so to speak, gone to his head, with the result that many reformers assumed it should be possible to make everybody live by reason all the time, when actually the great majority of people can never live by reason only, but by habit and by faith? And so she's sort of trying to make us address this, and maybe this comes back to the question of what is democracy? A kind of fantasy, a fantasy about rationality.
It's philosophy semantics eating itself, where you go so up your own arse about one semantic word that you lose all context and grounding to yourself or to your existence. And we all know those are the worst types of conversations to be had with anybody. Because you're just I have no idea who I am anymore because this one word cannot be defined. But then I think my concept of reason was really shaken. Even just that word reason, when one of my friends was training to be a lawyer, and they just said all of law is based on that one word, reasonable. And what defines reason? And that's a group of reasonable people defining what something is to be reasonable. And you're why even is that? You realize that there's just that concept of reason is just fluff. And if you're good at persuading, which is what lawyers do, is they can shift that. And so all of your reason is based on storytelling and perception. And you're just if all of it's based on that, then reason becomes so difficult to pin down. And it's
hardcore, that's the same as all culture.
Yeah.
All areas of everything. It's just all existing.
Yeah, exactly. And it pulls you back to whenever you kind of lose yourself in that level of existentialism, you're going through all of this and you go back to therapy and you're like, I don't know what to do anymore. And then
I agree. There was a point that Helen made where she said the obscure expected to have boundaries in certain psychoanalytical circles, because that to me was like one of the best things I've heard about psychoanalysis, because I find when I was, and I only trained, I didn't finish, so I don't want to sound like an expert, but I found psychoanalysis dangerous in a way. Because of the endlessness of it. And when you're meeting clients or patients, for example, who have had endless thoughts of what if, where am I, God knows, where's life, where's the end and beginning of the story I'm telling, where's the story that I'm living? Psychoanalysis is like, we'll go deeper. And it's like, actually, that's not useful. The art therapy institution I studied in also said that art therapy is non-directive, so it does have a heavy psychoanalytical leaning. So it's non-directive, as in let them draw, see what comes up, talk to them about it, let them sculpt, let them draw, let them make, see what comes up. I also found that a little dangerous. I also find it's a mechanism in philosophy of somebody says something, somebody doubts it, somebody then creates a kind of more informed meaning, somebody doubts it, someone creates another informed meaning. I think in terms of Western philosophy now, we've reached a point where it's kind of becoming circular in terms of how you apply it to everyday life. And if the question is, why is it important, Ash, while you're talking about everyday life? I would say it's important because so many of these philosophers were talking about mental health. When you're talking and philosophizing, you've made millions of pounds out of talking about mental health and psychoanalysis and all these things. There needs to be a direct line to how that works in practice, in the everyday.
If I could just say on the psychoanalytic point, not all forms of psychoanalysis are open-ended talking therapy. Some do have a distinct conclusion. And so it does depend what sort of school you go through. I've been through psychoanalysis. I specifically asked this question. I said, I don't want to be like Woody Allen talking like endlessly. And my analyst was amazing. She said, that's obviously we're doing something for him to keep going back. But I said, I want a, conclusion. And the Lacanian school is more scientific, so that there is an outcome, and it's more artistic and more existential. I don't want to sound like a fanboy. I didn't know what it was when I went in it, but it's a different school to Kleinian, kind of open-ended.
And I think there was a point that I was trying to form her doodles and her notebooks and her art, trying to see what she feels. And what she wants is to run away from reason and find joy. And I think there's a huge reaction to that, where our existentialist reason semantics has pushed everybody almost to the other side, where it's very hard to see what we want. And you see this big reaction with all the people on TikTok, with all the people online, suddenly trying to use the psychology that's available to them in every sort of which way, and then try to figure out how they feel. But then it's swung so far the other way, and it becomes completely unreasonable. And it's this weird seesaw that I see that happens at the moment, with people really trying to sit within their feelings and really trying to figure out what they want or figure out how to feel again as a reaction to this democratic reason. And then it kind of, you can lose all sort of thread or groundedness to the reality of life. So it's like this strange little seesaw. And I wonder if you have seen that in the stuff that you've been studying as well. In the modernists.
Losing oneself in oneself.
The losing of oneself in oneself, and then the balancing out. If that had a balancing out, or if there was a tipping, maybe that created into the absurd, or fell off into the absurd, and that just had to sit and stew for a while before coming out of it.
I don't know.
I don't know if I want to say this so much, but I feel like the conversation has put into kind of talking about value in the kind of really indirect way. We're kind of going around in circles thinking about what is the value of old ideas, or what is the value of how can we implement this in society, and how can we fix and redeem society with all of this stuff. And I think that what my reaction is is I kind of just start thinking to myself about how I just want to go home and like write or read and stuff, and, like be on my own, because like I don't want to fix everything.
Do you know what though? It's like, because I was the same with all the music. I have these conversations, exactly what you just said, quite a lot of them, innit? Because people right now have this idea that Britain is successful at making music because they think of David Bowie and the Pistols and New Order or whatever. Actually, decades ago, like last year in the UK charts, the British normal album chart, there was one debut album in the top 200, and that's the only debut album by a British artist in the last 2 years. Anybody know who they are?
No.
Last Dinner Party is financed by rich parents. That's it. Yeah. We don't have artists breaking through in music. And one of the reasons is they've forgotten that historically there's a link between pop music and art. In art colleges and things like modernism, are very important to remember, the Bauhaus and T.S. Eliot and whatever. But
then that's where the practice of creativity, no matter what it is, if it's the doodling, if it's the writing or whatever, should always be encouraged, because that's where it comes from.
Yeah, like fanzine thing, just, really got to encourage it.
Yeah.
But how sad that like the practice of creativity has become radical because it's not accessible to capitalism.
Yeah.
That's why I brought up the Last Dinner Party. The name says it all.
Yeah.
But I also respect that feeling of maybe we should go to bed.
I wasn't saying.
No, I know.
I was like thinking of like art for art's sake and like getting away from this whole kind of.
We get
value.
trapped where we have to try and defend what we're doing, but then we start instrumentalised. Certainly those of us in universities, as I said, I'm writing endless grant applications and things like that, where you just end up instrumentalising what you're doing, even though you believe in what you're doing. That's the kind of insane position that you find yourself.
But then creativity is contagious. So as long as you can even do a bit and show, if that public arts isn't there or the grant applications are bringing you down, even the little bit that's there that can be shared from your immediate, even if there's privilege in that, it's sharing and it's contagious. And I do think that practice is so important, because you show other people and they get the courage or they get the inspiration to do it themselves, and somehow that breaks the top-down power of removal of all of those assets and resources. And there's one thing that I wanted to kind of like say, which is that we all have access to writing ability, and we often don't put writing and literature within the same arts category in a sort of visual sense. And we can all speak and we can blog, or we can write little phrases anywhere, we can write graffiti, and all of those little pieces of literary art are also a rebellion. And I think like there's not enough focus on the fact that literacy and literary art can be much more free and much more like democratic in a way.
In 1940, Virginia Woolf gave a talk to the Workers' Educational Association, to the Brighton branch of the Workers' Educational Association. It was later published as an essay that's called The Leaning Tower. But that's the one where she comes up with a very, like, what subsequently becomes a kind of canonical phrase in Woolf scholarship. But she's talking about public libraries, and public libraries as the common ground, like literature as the common ground. She kind of juxtaposing public libraries with those kind of libraries that are enclosed within like Oxbridge colleges, and she exhorts her audience, who are this Brighton branch of the Workers' Educational Association, to trespass on the common ground. And it's a nice idea. It's a very powerful image of what libraries, public libraries anyway, might give to people in terms of access.
When you said the quote about reason, it sort of very much made me think about the way that the main two parties sort of tend to try to present themselves as sort of like sensible and in a way that doesn't really talk to people's pain and suffering. And I feel like for me that seemed to be the thing that resonated with that passage.
Yeah, I think you're right. The kind of the claim to being reasonable does not speak to the pain, the suffering, the passions of real lived experience.
Is this a secular? I mean, I think it's very timely, the work that you're doing, in the sense of it's a bit like the time for a new modernism, isn't it? With the same patterns of far right and and people talking to that, telling people what they want to hear, and that communicating, and the moderate middle ground doesn't communicate. It's really interesting. It needs disrupting again, as we're all saying, whether it's artistic or the movements.
Yeah. Whilst the kind of centre ground are all talking about being rational, then you just leave this gap, is what Milner's saying in the 30s and what's happening now, that you leave this gap where all the kind of the raging passions just start burning and